Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chai Talk for the Left Hook Substack, where I invite a subject matter expert who is far smarter than me to break down one question or questions in 30 minutes or less. And today, I have Imara Jones. Imara Jones is a black trans woman and expert in the anti-trans political movement, also an award-winning, and let me mention these awards. She was very, very humble, but I gotta mention them. Emmy Award-winning, Peabody Award-winning, creator of Translash Media, cross-platform nonprofit journalism and narrative organization, which produces content to shift the current culture of hostility towards transgender people in the US. She was also named Time Magazine Person of the Year, 100 most influential people on the planet in 2023. And she also hosts the Translash podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, Amara. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
The big question I have, and big questions I have, is this blitzkrieg of hate against the transgender communities unleashed by MAGA and Trump. How will that usher in an age of authoritarianism and also deprive the rest of Americans of our rights? And people don't make the connection, Imara. And before I turned on record, I was telling you that some Democrats, even in the past few years, got swept up in the anti-trans fear, the anti-trans backlash. Oh, they're coming after our kids. We might have to vote for Donald because of this. And now, as we're recording this on a Tuesday, on the ninth day of the Trump presidency, a few of these folks, Imara, are like, whoopsie, oops, they're coming after us. But before we get to that, I want to talk about this news yesterday, where, again, this fierce targeting, this attack, I would say this cruel attack on transgender communities, especially the transgender armed forces. Can you talk about what the latest attack is on the transgender members who serve in our armed forces right now?
Mhm. The fulfilling their campaign promise, the Trump administration issued an executive order which charges and gives authority to the Secretary of Defense to expel the many thousands of trans people, 15,000 trans people who are
Mm,
serving in the military across both the active armed forces and the National Guard, and also the reserves. And the point of that is to send a very clear signal about who belongs in society and who doesn't. And I would shift it a little bit and say, I don't think that this is about hate. I think this is a strategy. And I think
mm.
that we have to get out of thinking about this in emotional terms and to realize that the attack on trans people is a part of a strategy that the Trump administration has to remake the country. Starting with the easiest group of people, both as a road test to see how you can disenfranchise and isolate from public life large groups of Americans. Trans people are less than 1% of the population, so it's a really easy group to do this experiment on. And then secondly, it's a political strategy because they understand that the latent transphobia and discomfort for trans people that people have against trans people is actually an entry point into groups of people that they would not normally have conversations with, and that those conversations can convert those people to voters. So specifically, being anti-trans allows them to talk to suburban people who are educated. It allows them to talk to Latinos. It allows them to talk to Black evangelicals. And they know fundamentally that in the United States, that you don't actually need large groups of people to win an election, right?
Mm.
All American elections since 2004 are essentially marginal elections overwhelmingly. And that means that, to win a state, you need maybe 10, 15,000 votes out of millions. And so the anti-trans issue isn't designed to move large groups of people. It's designed to move the small numbers of people that you need to win in modern elections. And they did that to devastating effect in this last election. They attribute their victory to the marginal advantage that being anti-trans gave them in the election. And a lot of the things that they are doing is fulfilling the promise that they made to the young men between the ages of 18 and 35 who put them over the finish line, who themselves are anti-trans, that they are living up to their pledge to create room in society for them by targeting and removing other groups of people. And, what I tell people all the time is that when you have a political force that targets a group of people, they never stop with just one group of people.
Mm.
That right the way around the world, every authoritarian regime that is in power right now always starts with trans people and people who are outside of the gender binary. Every single one.
Yep.
So whether or not it's Russia, or whether or not it's Xi in China, or whether or not it's in Uganda, or whether or not it is Orban in Hungary, like they all share that. And so honestly, the American people allow themselves to be duped.
Yep.
Like this is the oldest playbook in the book, and they fell for it.
A lot to unpack there, Imara, but I think you're even more generous than me. I do think there's some fear and hate there that I've heard expressed that has been manufactured. And speaking about that manufacturing of that fear and that targeting of the latest bogey person, transgender communities, I think it was $140 million that was spent by Republicans in ads against transgender communities. I watch football, and every Sunday for weeks, I saw this one ad. Donald Trump is going to protect you, and Kamala is for they, them. And you're right that this is part and parcel of a strategy that has been going on decades, right? It's a Southern strategy on steroids. And it seems like America doesn't learn. Let's take it back, though, because I'm in Virginia and I saw this playing out about 3.5 years ago. And I wrote a piece in the Daily Beast where I said, this reminds me, much like you, I did the same breakdown of this hate machine. You have it on your podcast. You said an Emmy for it, correct? For a
Webby,
Webby for it.
awesome.
I did something similar called Fear Incorporated, the Roots of the Islamophobia Network in America for the CAP, Center for American Progress think tank in 2011, where the bookie person at that time was Muslims. And I saw this happening in right here in Virginia. I'm like, it's the exact same playbook. They just literally took out Muslim and put in trans. Can you break down the playbook?
Well, I just want to say a couple of things. I think first of all, it's $215 million
Mm.
in the ads. So it's whatever, 50% larger even than what you imagine it to be. So it
But
was
still an
the
obscene amount of money.
it was the single largest ad buy of the entire campaign.
Mm.
So from the Trump campaign's perspective, it was an anti-trans campaign. I think secondly, what I would say is that it's not moving from group to group. Like they haven't like unleashed these things on trans people and stopped targeting Muslims. Like we had a Muslim ban last week. So like it's not like they're moving from group to group. It is actually they are trying to isolate. Let me take a step back. So everything that the Trump administration has done can be explained by the Great Replacement Theory,
Yeah.
that essentially in the country, from their telling of the story, that you can chart America's decline from when it started to become more racially diverse, more diverse in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity, and more religiously diverse. And that essentially what you need in order for America to return to greatness is a reassertion of white patriarchy. And for many of them, that means white Christian patriarchy. You can even hear this echoed in certain people like Mark Zuckerberg, who's like, we need more masculine energy in the workplace. And so, from the perspective of great replacement theory, if a part of their goal is to increase the number of white births in the country and white people in the country, then you have to enforce the gender binary. Like targeting trans people actually is an essential part of that project, which
Mm.
is why they have spent so much energy into it, because it's not only a cynical political project. These are actually deeply held beliefs. Like I wish they were just cynical politics, because you could deal with them in a different way. The reason why they have so much energy behind them, the reason why they're prosecuted with so much vigor is because these are deeply held beliefs by the people that run the country,
Right.
right? And I think that that's one of the things that's lost. I also think that it is different than what's in the past. And the reason why it's different is that from the Southern strategy was essentially sectional. And there was honestly a week and a nod in the Republican Party, which is, yeah, we kind of are doing this stuff and we're ginning them up around race, but essentially there wasn't a belief to fundamentally undo the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement, right? They were just trying to use resentment for political gain. Right now, there is an intent to undo those things, to
Mm,
undo the Immigration Act of 1965, which removed race as a barrier to entry after the Civil Rights Act, right? There is a move to undo all of the laws around gender equity and rulings in the Supreme Court. Like they are actually trying to undo all of those things. And so I wish that it was a little bit because again, like you would know how to deal with a Lee Atwater in a way, because Lee Atwater didn't expect to win power and actually destroy the Civil Rights Act. What's different now is that these people are in power, have come to power, and they are trying to tear down 50 years
yep.
of legal infrastructure in the United States to turn back the clock. And if you believe that white patriarchy has to be asserted, you have to target trans people. Like that project is incomplete unless you do that.
And Lee Atwater was the infamous Republican strategist who openly said that you can no longer say the N-word right now. You need to have these, if you will, soft terms, dog
Right.
whistles. But now you can have Elon Musk literally doing the Nazi salute, and we have to assume that he's throwing his heart out. And I'm glad you mentioned that because I used to say, oh, they want to, when it came to MAGA about 8 years ago, I said they want to take us back to 1952, 1953, pre-Brown versus Board of Education. I'm like, I probably missed it by a century. They want to go back to when it was white Christian men, or rather, I should say, white Christian straight men. And before we take it to a local level, I'm so glad you talked about the replacement theory because now, thanks to Republicans, this conspiracy theory that Imara talked about, it's a neo-Nazi conspiracy theory that went to Europe, came back to America. Over a third of Americans believe in some aspect of this, thanks to mainstreaming by Donald Trump, Elise Stefanik, and Republicans. It has radicalized terrorists to commit violence against Jews, against Black people, against Muslims, and against Latinos. Can you talk to us about how MAGA in particular and this very deliberate targeted attack on the transgender communities to effectuate this idea of recreating this mythic past where white Christian men on top has been outsourced to Europe? How are European hate mongers learning from our hate, especially when it comes to attacking the transgender community abroad?
Yeah, I just want to also add the number of people. The SPLC came out with a report, Southern Poverty Law Center came out with a report last year and said two things, right? One, that the number of hate groups in America is the highest since they've been counting in over 4 decades.
Wow.
And secondly, that half of all hate groups last year engaged in some form of anti-LGBTQ violence,
Mm,
right? Like it is becoming, it became the acceptable way to express their hate. And one of the things that makes the release of the Proud Boys so dangerous is that those groups now have been returned to them, their most sort of trained and seasoned leaders who have already primed them for anti-LGBTQ and anti-other forms of violence. And so, we are at the highest level of political violence in the United States, and they're being unleashed on our communities puts us all at risk in a way that probably none of us have seen in our lifetimes, right?
mm,
It's hard to underestimate the danger. And the way that it works internationally is that these groups are in constant conversation with each other, right? That like they are constantly learning. And we know that both for like in terms of the nonviolent groups, like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is essentially the Christian nationalist ACLU, they have chapters all around the world, but including in Hungary, including in the United Kingdom, including all around Europe, where they workshop and learn from and transfer things that have been done in the United States to those regimes. They see how they worked there, and then they come back. So I guarantee you, a lot of the things that we're seeing right now that are anti-LGBTQ, we know that we have seen them, as I said before, in Russia and in
yep.
Hungary and elsewhere. And that's because these groups are in league with each other. I also want to say that we also know that the Proud Boys, for example, is an international organization. It is one of the reasons why in Canada and New Zealand and Australia, for example, they are on the terrorist watch list. The Proud Boys are designated in many of America's closest allies in the exact same way as ISIS, right? The way that who the country has deemed as a mortal threat. And it is because these organizations have these international links as well, both armed and not armed. Lastly, ideologically, I think that we forget that one of America's greatest exports is its segregationist and racist past, right? That one of the motivators and the learning points for the Nuremberg laws was actually was actually the Alabama state constitution, the segregationist Alabama state constitution, because they saw that it was one of the more complete holistic forms for a minority to govern a majority. And so that
I
was
think people forget that Nazis were so enamored, impressed by U.S. slavery and segregation. They're like, wow, they've really perfected it. We can
that's
be
right.
inspired by this.
That's right. That's right. That segregation in the United States was a model for fascism in the United States. And so, therefore, this natural affinity that the worst of America's past, with fascism as an affinity point, it makes sense that they would continue to be in conversation from each other and to learn from each other. As a matter of fact, the segregationist constitutions across the U.S. states were also the model for the apartheid constitution.
Mm.
That's why the apartheid regime also was in conversation and enamored with Nazis as well and fascism. So I think that we have to understand that like we are engaged with these dark forces that have never truly gone away.
And it's important to know the nexus between these international movements. They're just like this. They go back and forth. And
That's right.
I mentioned the report I wrote, Fear Incorporated. Everything that you're saying, Amara, about I joke that love has gone intersectional, but so has hate.
Right.
It's the same thing with the Islamophobia. It's the European Islamophobes learning from the American Islamophobes, inviting each other, repeating talking points, testing out in local markets, funding each other, literally funding each other's defense against, when they were prosecuted for inciting hate. And all the people who were seen as marginal, right? Imara, in 2012, 2013, 2014, the Republican Party here vomited out these extremists. Fast forward 10 years, all these people now are in the mainstream. And another point you mentioned that I
That's
think
right.
is very important that I always try to stress, because oftentimes it isn't stressed, is that you said when it comes to these extremist movements, whether it's ISIS, Al Qaeda, KKK, any right-wing groups, the DNA of much of these folks is the same, right? And one of the things that kind of unites all of them is this very strict, very binary understanding of gender, right? It's very clear. Men on top, women at the bottom. Women are in the four corners of the home. Men are the warriors. The woman's greatest gift or honor is to birth the warrior. But then where does it leave the 1% to 2% or 1.5%? I'm so glad you said that number because people inflate numbers of Jews, black people, Muslims, and the transgender communities. It's hilarious. I'm sure you've read it. They think they're like, we're 20% Muslims. We're like, just 1%. Um, where does that leave those who are transgender, non-binary, intersex?
Well, I mean, it's also just a flaw. First of all, who wants to live in a culture where men are on top and women's only job is to birth a warrior? That sounds
White
frightening to me.
supremacists.
Like, yes, it is white supremacist. Like, I can tell from your top shelf that you two are a sci-fi and fantasy fan. And for me, that's like it's like living in a Klingon culture, right? Like, I guess that's what they want. I think that although Klingons have honor,
They
I
have a
think
code, Imara.
right,
Let's not
exactly.
disparage the Klingons. They have some code
Exactly.
at least.
Exactly. They have a very, exactly right. I think that the thing about this is that they've made it very clear and intent that what they are doing is um, to target, isolate, and demonize groups of people in order to remove them from public life. The removal of those people from public life, including access to public services and jobs, by the way, like
Mm.
DEI is about telling corporations how they run their companies, right? And who should be running their companies,
But the
right?
free market, Imara, the free market.
Right. And this is what I mean that like the whole point that they're trying to do is to target groups of people, to take them out of public life in order to make space for white dominance from their particular perspective. And we can't be blind to that. Like that's what's happening. And it's why I think that people need to become very suspicious when you hear about attacks on other groups of people. If you think that it's only about those group of people, that means you haven't learned anything from history.
I think that's very important, because, and I really hope people are listening, Imara, because before I pressed record on this, I told you that in my communities, in these suburban communities in Virginia, I've been very saddened to hear from many Democrats, people who held their nose and voted for Kamala, or some people who didn't for a variety of reasons. Even now, after all of this, even after a plurality of Americans decide to destroy themselves and elect Trump, a convicted criminal, they still say, but these liberals, these Democrats, they've gone too far on the trans issue. It's almost as if they think that they're separate, right? And these are people of color. These are black folks. These are Muslims. These are
That's right.
Asians. They think that they will be okay. To those people watching right now who say, I'll make a carve out for trans because that's just too weird. What do you have to say to them?
Well, I think two things. I think one, I would just reiterate what I said, which is that uh, if you think that it's only about trans people, then you haven't learned anything from history and you're being duped and used. And so if that's where you want to be, I can't, I don't know what to tell you, but that's just the reality. I think the other thing that I would say is that what are you talking about? Trans people didn't run the campaign. No trans person was allowed to speak at the DNC.
And Palestinians, so that's what they have in common in trans people.
Right? No one was allowed to speak. The Democratic Party, in response to the single largest ad buy to the campaign, $250 million that targeted trans people, didn't defend any of the trans people and didn't say anything in defense. So I don't know how that's trans people's fault. And I don't know how it's fault that in the closing days of the Biden administration that they stopped defending a range of things that were meant to protect trans people. So when you say trans people are doing too much or trans people are kind of driving the agenda, that's just not based by fact. I mean, what
Mhm.
you're actually upset about is that trans people actually exist and you see them, right? Trans people, and that's the problem. And if you think that that's the problem, then I would really urge you to see whether or not you really believe in democracy. Again, at this point, I am in the mindset, quite frankly, that Donald Trump's existence is not only about Donald Trump, it's about the people, right? His election is a reflection of a deep character flaw in Americans. And until that character flaw is rectified, we are not going to get better leaders. And so the questions about a carve out or it's going too far really means that it's a reflection on you and your character. And you need to do that work if you intend and believe in democracy.
Well said. Final question I have for you, Imara, is because I have three kids. I refuse to be apathetic. At the same time, I'm a pragmatist. If there's an asteroid in the sky, I'm not going to tell people it'll be fine. I'll say, look up. But at the same time, I prepare. Uh, I believe it's going to be a long 4 to 8 to 12 years. I think we're in for a lot of pain, but that doesn't mean the story's finished. How can people at a local level push back?
One, you need to find people who believe in the same things you believe. I think one of the things that's been distressing to people, it sounds like even in your own personal circumstances, that even people who you thought you were in common cause with, you may not necessarily be. And so what that means is that you have to find people who are, right? And that means really small groups of people, like you have to think in like you're talking in groups of threes and fours, right? Think about small groups of people that you could begin to commiserate with, build with, have conversations with, and then figure out how you all are going to begin to act and move. Beyond that, I think it means doing the small things like start going to your school board meetings, start going to your city council meetings, start going to your PTA meetings and ask why certain books are removed
Mm.
or certain teachers are being have gag orders placed upon them, right? Like democracy is a muscle, and standing up to authoritarianism is a muscle. And like any muscle, you have to exercise it, you have to practice it in order for it to go stronger. And I would think that like starting small right now, be in those small ways is really, really important.
Amen. Imara, come back anytime to talk about how we can take on the fascists together and create what I call the multicultural Avengers. Imara, please shamelessly promote yourself. How can people support you? Where can people find you?
You can follow me at my name at Imara Jones across all of the platforms. It's pretty easy to find me. You can also visit my website, also my name. And for Translash, you can go to translash.org and follow Translash Media across various platforms. That's also a great way to get different perspectives. And lastly, I would say if you're a podcaster, go and sign up for the Translash podcast. It's an area of freedom and a breath of fresh air that takes on a variety of issues and topics, and we host voices that you're not going to hear from. So I think those are all really good things to do and places to start. We also have a newsletter, so go sign up for our newsletter.
All of it. Do all of it, folks. Thank you all for watching another episode of Chai Talk with Wajahat Ali. Until next time, stay safe, stay sane, and please don't be a fascist. Take care.